The cell was cold and damp, the light of dawn filtering faintly through the narrow slit of a window. Thomas Cromwell sat with his head bowed, hands trembling against the wooden bench. Hours away lay the scaffold, the axe, and the roar of the crowd. He had once been the architect of power itself, a man who bent kings and kingdoms with words written on parchment. Yet now he awaited his end like the most common of traitors. His breath came slowly, as if each moment were a weight pressing upon his chest. Outside the tower walls, the city stirred. Bells rang, their echo rolling over London, reminding him of the many churches he had silenced, the monasteries he had stripped bare, the secrets he had once commanded. Now those same bells tolled as if announcing not his triumphs, but his fall. Every sound cut through him with a cruel irony. He had raised himself from the son of a blacksmith to the master of England, second only to the king. And still the world would remember him not as a savior of crowns, but as a condemned man who lost the king's favor. There was no redemption waiting on Tower Hill, only the axe and the jeering crowd. His body would fall in disgrace, but the shadow of his story would not vanish. It would linger as a warning that power is fragile, that a single step can transform glory into ruin. Stay with me until the very end of this tale to witness the terrifying final days of Thomas Cromwell, and subscribe to our channel. Never miss the secrets history tried to bury. Thomas Cromwell was born far from palaces, in the smoke and heat of Putney, where his father's forge rang with iron and rage. His childhood was rough, marked not by privilege but by fists and hunger. At a young age, he fled across the Channel, drifting through the markets of Florence and the crowded streets of Antwerp, fighting for survival as a soldier and learning the silent languages of trade and law. These years gave him no noble titles, but they gave him weapons sharper than steel. He returned to England hardened, fluent in tongues, skilled in finance, and quick with the pen. By fortune or fate, he entered the service of Cardinal Wolsey, the towering minister who stood almost as a second king. Under Wolsey, he drafted contracts, oversaw estates, and absorbed every secret of how power moved behind closed doors. But Cromwell never forgot that all power in Tudor England rested on the desires of one man alone. When Henry VIII grew restless with his Queen Catherine of Aragon, it was Wolsey who bore the impossible burden of freeing him. The king's heart had been captured by Anne Boleyn, and his longing was no private indulgence. It was a hunger for renewal, for a wife who might give him the son Catherine had never delivered. Wolsey tried every path across Europe, petitioning Rome, bargaining with France, twisting diplomacy until the cords snapped in his hands. Yet the Pope refused to grant the annulment. Each failure deepened Henry's fury. The mighty cardinal, once feared across Christendom, now faced disgrace. Within a breath, his vast palaces were emptied, his servants dismissed, his name blackened by the king he had served so faithfully. Most men in Wolsey's circle fled or fell silent, but Cromwell did not. He saw in Henry's anger not only danger, but opportunity. Where Wolsey pleaded for papal approval, Cromwell dared to imagine a different path. If Rome would not bend, then England must stand apart. The king could make himself supreme head of his own church, free to cast aside Catherine and crown Anne as queen. These were radical words, spoken in whispers at first, but they were exactly what Henry longed to hear. With this vision, Cromwell stepped from the shadows. He transformed himself from a servant of a fallen minister into the voice of royal ambition. He had turned Anne Boleyn's allure into a weapon, Catherine's barrenness into a cause, and the king's private longing into a revolution. This was the first step that drew him close to Henry's side. And from that moment forward, Cromwell would never again be merely an observer. He was now the architect of the king's desire. The 1530s were the decade in which Thomas Cromwell revealed his true nature. Henry's wish for Anne Boleyn might have remained a scandal whispered in corridors. Cromwell turned it into a revolution. With a pen and a vision, he unchained England from Rome. Parliament passed acts that no one had dared to imagine. The king was declared supreme head of the church, and the Pope's shadow vanished from English soil. A private hunger had become a national creed, and Cromwell was the hand that wrote it into law. Yet his talent went further than rewriting statutes. He knew that the strength of a kingdom was not in soldiers alone, but in secrets, from abbots to merchants, from scribes to wandering friars. His web of informants stretched across the land. Reports flowed into his chambers telling of monks feasting while peasants starved, of gold hidden in altars, of vows broken in silence. Cromwell gathered these fragments and bound them into a narrative of corruption. Before Parliament, he laid them out, and the monasteries, once pillars of faith, crumbled like rotting beams. The gold of centuries poured into the royal treasury, and the people whispered that Cromwell's pen was sharper than any blade. His genius was not limited to the church. At the heart of the court, he mastered the art of removing obstacles with precision. Anne Boleyn, once his ally, became his target when Henry's affection turned to loathing. Cromwell constructed charges of adultery and treason so meticulously that no protest could withstand them. Lords and commoners alike watched as the Queen walked to the scaffold, condemned not only by the king's fury, but by the machinery Cromwell had set in motion. To the world, it looked like lawful judgment. In truth, it was the purest example of political theater. All the while, Cromwell built something even more enduring. He established registers that recorded births and deaths, systems that tracked taxes and estates, offices that reported directly to the crown. He was forging a state that could outlive any single monarch. What others saw as ambition was in fact design. He was laying bricks for an empire of order, one that rested not on the sword, but on parchment, seal, and ledger. In these years, Cromwell reached a height that no man of such low birth had ever touched. He was not a general with armies, nor a prince with lands. He was a master of shadows who proved that true dominion lies in the control of information, the bending of law, and the reading of human desire. It was a brilliance that frightened his enemies and even unsettled his king. For in his orchestration of England's transformation, Cromwell seemed less a servant and more the silent composer of destiny itself. The fall of Anne Boleyn marked Cromwell's greatest triumph. He had delivered the king from a union that had turned to bitterness, and his mastery of law and intrigue seemed unrivaled. For a brief season, his voice carried further than any other in council. His seal stamped decrees that reshaped the kingdom. Yet with every victory, the ground beneath him grew less steady. Power had elevated him, but it had also isolated him. The nobles of old families swallowed their anger in silence. They saw a blacksmith's son seated above them, deciding the fate of estates older than his name. The clergy brooded in ruined cloisters, their prayers heavy with resentment for the man who had torn down monasteries and scattered relics. Cromwell had broken the spine of the old order, and the fragments of that broken world cut deep into the pride of those who had lost everything. In the council chamber, he felt the shift. Conversations dulled when he entered. Papers were passed more slowly. Greetings carried less warmth. Men who had once leaned toward him now leaned away. Eyes turned to the floor. He remained indispensable in the business of the crown. Yet the air carried a new chill, a quiet waiting for his step to falter. Stephen Gardiner refined his sermons, hinting that zeal had masked ambition. The Duke of Norfolk sharpened his patience, watching with the certainty that a fall would come. They did not need to conspire openly. They only had to wait for the moment when the king's heart grew restless once more. That moment began as little more than a glance. Among the courtiers was a young woman whose laughter softened the lines on Henry's weary face. Catherine Howard, Norfolk's niece, bright and untroubled, carried the kind of charm that Cromwell could never control. It was only a flicker then, but in the Tudor court, a flicker of desire could become a blaze strong enough to consume a minister. Cromwell pressed on, drafting statutes, enforcing reforms, convinced that loyalty and service would guard him as they always had. Yet each document he signed and each coin he counted became proof of how vast his reach had grown. His enemies sharpened their knives not on what he failed to do, but on the very successes that once secured his rise. The minister who had shaped a new church and silenced a queen now walked through halls heavy with suspicion. His triumph had not ended the struggle. It had merely set the stage for the gathering storm. The turning point came with a marriage that was meant to strengthen a kingdom, but instead shattered the man who arranged it. Cromwell urged the king toward Anne of Cleves, a German princess whose alliance promised safety against Catholic powers abroad. On paper it was flawless. Cromwell's skill with diplomacy, law, and counsel had carried him through every storm. He believed this match would be another triumph carved into his record of service. But when Henry met his new bride, he recoiled. Anne was nothing like the painted image that had traveled across the channel. The king whispered his disgust to those closest to him, declaring her unfit for his bed. For Cromwell, this was disaster. The minister who had risen on his ability to transform royal desire into political triumph had now bound the king to a union that offered neither pleasure nor passion. Enemies who had waited for years pounced. Norfolk and Gardiner whispered that Cromwell had deceived the king. The very tools that once elevated him turned against him. His mastery of Parliament was painted as manipulation. His network of informants was described as treachery. His reforms were no longer victories, but evidence of ambition that overreached loyalty. The words he had written with such certainty became weapons aimed at his throat. Meanwhile, the court shimmered with the presence of Catherine Howard, young, radiant, and linked by blood to Norfolk. She drew Henry's eyes like a flame. Every smile she gave deepened the king's disgust for Anne of Cleves, and with it his anger toward Cromwell. The minister who once gave Henry freedom now seemed to have trapped him in humiliation. Each moment Catherine's charm grew. Cromwell's position shrank. In this collision of desire and politics, he found himself cornered. He had built his career by channeling Henry's passions into law. Now passion turned against him. What had been his strength became his curse. The king felt betrayed, and betrayal at the Tudor court was a death sentence. The council gathered in whispers. Bill of Attainder was prepared, a law that condemned without trial. Cromwell's name was written upon it. Playing with secrets had brought him power, but secrets now branded him false. Playing with fire had lit his path, but fire now promised to consume him. The cruelty of it lay in the irony. Cromwell had served with absolute devotion, giving the king not only obedience but transformation. He had reshaped church and crown for Henry's will, only to be cast aside by the very monarch he had exalted. The Tudor court showed no mercy. Service did not protect. Loyalty did not shield. The minister who had stood above all now faced ruin not through rebellion, but through the shifting heart of the king he had trusted. And so Cromwell entered the twilight of his power. marked not by illness or age but by betrayal. The storm he had mastered for years had turned, and in its violent gusts, the man who once commanded England's destiny now felt the walls of the tower drawing close. Whispers moved faster than swords in the Tudor court. Cromwell's enemies, long patient, now had the weapon they needed. The failed marriage to Anne of Cleves hung around his neck like a millstone. Norfolk and Gardiner whispered that the minister had not only trapped the king in humiliation, but had cloaked himself in dangerous alliances with reformers. They spoke of heresy, of loyalty divided between crown and faith. And in their words, Cromwell was no longer a servant, but a traitor. Henry, restless and inflamed by his desire for Catherine Howard, listened. Every smile from the young woman deepened his resentment of the German bride Cromwell had given him. Norfolk reminded the king that Catherine was of noble blood and a niece of his own house. Gardiner pressed the claim that Cromwell had filled England with false doctrine. Together they struck at the very foundation of the king's trust. The machinery of law that Cromwell had once wielded became the blade turned against him. A bill of attainder was drawn up, condemning him without trial. It accused him of heresy, of protecting radicals, of using the king's authority for his own gain. The charges were thin shadows, but they did not need weight. They only needed the king's signature. On the morning of June 10th, 1540, Cromwell walked into the council chamber as he had done so many times before. He carried papers, ready to serve, believing still that loyalty would shield him. Norfolk rose, his voice carrying triumph, and named him traitor. Guards seized him before he could speak. The badge of the Order of the Garter was ripped from his chest. The silence of his colleagues spoke louder than any verdict. He was dragged through the same halls where he had once commanded obedience, now a prisoner of the crown he had built. The tower received him with cold stone and heavy iron. Days stretched into nights, each marked by bells that tolled like reminders of monasteries he had destroyed. He wrote letters to Henry, words soaked in loyalty, pleading for mercy. None were answered. The king who had trusted him above all others now reveled in new passion, his heart far from mercy. On July 28th, Cromwell was led from the tower. A crowd gathered, eager to see the fall of the man who had ruled from the shadows. He knelt on Tower Hill, pale from weeks in confinement, yet composed. His final words declared his faith and loyalty. The axe fell clumsily, striking more than once, turning his death into a scene of horror. Gasps and cries rose from the people. For even in death, Cromwell was denied dignity. As his blood stained the scaffold, Henry celebrated his marriage to Catherine Howard. The contrast was merciless. The servant who had given the king everything ended his life as a condemned traitor, while the monarch he had served laughed in the embrace of youth. In that moment, the true cruelty of the Tudor throne was laid bare. The scaffold was washed, but the memory of Cromwell's death clung to the stones of Tower Hill. His head was lifted before the crowd, a spectacle meant to remind all of the price of ambition. The man who had once spoken in the king's voice was silenced, his blood joining the countless victims of a dynasty that thrived on fear. Inside the palace, Henry VIII celebrated with laughter, the music of his new marriage echoing over the city that had just watched his most trusted servant die. This was the cruelty of the Tudor throne. Joy and slaughter walked hand in hand. A man could give his life in service for decades and be discarded in a single morning. Cromwell was not the first, and he would not be the last. Queens, courtiers, and counselors all learned that under Henry, devotion ended not with gratitude but with the axe. The reforms Cromwell had created endured, yet they were stained by the manner of his fall. He had torn monasteries apart and stripped altars of their relics, building a new order where the king ruled both state and soul. But the same hand that wrote these laws was cut away without hesitation. In this, there was a darker lesson. The Tudor monarchy did not reward loyalty. It consumed it. It fed on those who rose too high, swallowing them the moment their usefulness waned. Henry VIII was remembered as a king of great ambition, but also as a man who devoured his world. He cast aside wives, destroyed friends, and turned on servants who had given him everything. Cromwell's fate was a mirror held up to Henry's cruelty. The king rejoiced in new love while the blood of his minister dried on the wood of the scaffold. This contrast revealed the heart of Tudor power. It was dazzling, ruthless, and merciless. Cromwell's ghost lingers in history not as a man of pity, but as a warning. His rise showed that brilliance could build a kingdom from paper and ink. His death showed that the same kingdom could crush its builders without remorse. The Tudors left behind cathedrals, palaces, and a nation transformed, but also a trail of bones that bore witness to their hunger. If you wish to descend further into these hidden chapters, where ambition is crowned and loyalty is punished, follow us, subscribe to our channel, and uncover the stories that reveal the true cost of power in a world where mercy was never more than an illusion.